Hi, everyone. I wanted to start today by offering you some style tips as you work on drafting your paper, first for peer review and then also for final submission. And the three areas that I plan to cover are epigraph, word choice, and editing for concision and staying on topic. And the reason why I'm focusing on style tips today is because style is what elevates you from an average writer to a more rhetorically effective, persuasive, and engaging writer, right? You want readers to follow you, that you want readers to want to read what you write because your style captivates them and also is able to convey more articulately the argument and your position on that argument. So I love epigraphs. I think epigraphs can really lend a lot to a paper that we write. And epigraphs began in the 1700s. In the early 18th century, there became a new reading class, and that was the middle class. And the middle class didn't necessarily have the classical education that the upper classes had. And here we're talking specifically about males at this point. And that classical education would have taught them the ancient philosophers, it would have taught them the seminal texts, literary and otherwise, that begin to shape a dialogue between texts themselves, because anything that is written is always in conversation with what's around it currently and also what's in the past. Okay, so an epigraph began in the early 1700s as a way to give kind of a shortcut to middle class readers to cue them into the text that this particular one that the epigraph has is drawing from or entering into that conversation with. And so it can be really helpful even in our own writing, because what it can do is show that, hey, I'm not just, in this paper, for instance, I'm not just proposing an argument, position, or solution, or cause and effects. I am engaging in the current conversation around that topic, and it is meaningful to do so, okay? So the epigraph is a standalone quote at the beginning of a piece of writing. For our purposes, we want it to summarize your argument, such as your thesis, right? You want to summarize your argument by offering an apt quote, or lead into the framing of the argument, which is, the frame here is not like a bookends. We often talk about framing in terms of how are you going to, you're going to start a paper with a story and then end in that story to kind of wrap it up. That's not what we're talking about here with framing. With framing here, we're asking you to consider what's at stake and what type of, what matters about the position you're taking, right? So for instance, if you're going to be writing about animal welfare and you're taking the position that science needs to stop using animals in their experiments, then maybe your frame would be to position the argument around this idea that just as humans are animals and have feelings and have value to their life, so too are the other animals in this world, right? So you might want to draw from somebody who has some authority on that and pull from that, right? So epigraphs then serve to begin to manipulate readers' perspective. And manipulate is a word that often has an ugly connotation, like, oh, it's bad. But really, manipulation is working your audience, right? You are trying to elicit a specific response based on the purpose of your paper. And an epigraph can begin to help shape that response by pivoting your reader to what you want them to think about and consider, right? And an epigraph can also build credibility because it should draw from a particularly poignant, meaning relatable literary text, or from a public intellectual, scholar, politician, journalist, something published by them invested in the same viewpoint as you, the writer. So because you then showcase that you're entering into a conversation that's already happening, it lends credibility to the fact that you know what is the current debate about this issue. All right, and that's why I really love to use epigraphs in this way. I use it in my own writing as well. Okay, so we have some epigraph do's and don'ts. I'd like you to do, right? Choose a thought-provoking, succinct quote. You don't want to overburden your reader with too lengthy a quote because your paper is only, at most 1,500 or so words, depending on the assignment that I'm assigning you. Sometimes it could be more or less, right? So you don't want a quote that is longer than your introduction, for example. And you want it to be thought-provoking. You want the reader to pause on that quote and consider what value it brings to your argument. You do want to select carefully. It must serve a purpose, okay? Which means that it must connect to your topic. You want to consider lines from poetry, fiction, drama, government documents, speeches, interviews, editorials, right? Because any of these, as long as they're related to the topic and published by credible sources, you're going to be good to go, right? Finally, you've got to cite it. It has to be on your works cited. Okay, and this relates to the don'ts. Do not quote from an untraceable source, like offering a pithy statement with unknown afterward or anonymous, right? This leads into cliches. What we want to do in all of our writing is to avoid cliches, right? A cliche you might find common these days is, what's a cliche? I'm gonna say a cliche that I've heard recently is, in my own life, you wouldn't be faced with this if you weren't strong enough for it, right? That's a type of cliche, or I don't know, you get the point. Okay. So you don't want to quote from an unpublished source or an uncredible source. So don't quote from your neighbor, from your mom, from yourself. Don't make up something and pass it off as an epigraph. And also don't quote from an uncredible source. So if you're quoting, it has to be someone your readers will respect, okay? And who your readers will value in terms of them being someone who has some insight into the topic you are addressing in the paper. And then you just don't want to overquote, right? And that it aligns with the do offer a succinct quote. So I just want to show you an example of something I published back in 2011 that uses an epigraph. And here, the title of my piece, this is literary criticism here. The penalties of a well-known name, Ouida, she's the author, celebrity, and a sensational friendship. So I use the quote, let me move my window aside. I wonder at Ouida's novels, and I wonder still more at Ouida. What manner of woman can Ouida be, right? So what this quote does is it permits the reader to start also wondering about who Ouida can be, because that's something I'm going to address in this paper. But it also connects to celebrity, and this idea, it's a theory called the hermeneutics of intimacy, and it's this idea of authors at this period who were celebrities in the 19th century, authors standing in as personal acquaintances to their readers. So readers really felt like they knew Ouida, and yet Ouida also used that to her advantage because she had a persona, right? So they never really knew Ouida. They knew what she wanted them to know. And if you notice here, I have the author, the publication, and the page number, okay? So that's something you would need as well. You could format it as I do here, which is just a smaller font size with no quotes, and then the author, the publication, and the page number. And what I do here is if you actually were to read on with the excerpt I gave you, the introduction, you would see that the epigraph actually relates to this query about what man or woman can Ouida be. Okay, moving on, we have, we have word choice now as something that we want to consider. And word choice, hide the floating meter controls, and word choice is really important in elevating your style, right? So you want to use descriptive words like for verbs. You don't want to use, as much as you can help it, to be verbs, or when you're introducing an author or some text, the word said, right? So to be verbs usually, or the verb to be usually is just too vague, and it wastes your space. It wastes the ability for you to convey meaning through the word itself. So details, argues, suggests, contends, considers, right? Considers, rejects, all of these are better than to be, because they also imply an action and a particular take on that action. All right. You want to use specific nouns for people, places, things, and ideas. So if you're going to talk about, let's say, a person, you want to name that person and give some background. If you're talking about a place, you want to name the place and give some background. If you're talking about a thing, such as, I'm going to stick to a really basic thing here, a broom, you're not going to call it the thing. You're going to call it the broom and move on, right? Same with ideas. The idea expresses is too vague, but when people identify themselves as transgender, that action expresses, right? That's a more articulate way to identify the idea. You also want to write in formal academic language and tone. So what I mean by that is essentially how I'm speaking here. You want to avoid the contractions. You do not, there I go, you do not want to use slang. So by slang, here's an example. Kid is slang. Children is more formal, right? What's another slang that I see commonly? Search up. Search up is slang. It's not grammatically accurate. Research is formal and academic in tone and grammatically accurate. Okay. Next, we have editing. And word choice can be done in the editorial process, but also when we think about editing, we want to look at editing for concision and editing for staying on topic. So for concision, which I know many of us struggle with, including me, you want to identify the filler words or superlatives and remove. And these words include indeed, very, like, that, phrases like because of, right? So one of the ways you can do this is you want to read a paragraph and ask yourself as well, when we're thinking about concision, for each sentence, have I already stated this point? Am I developing my paper by repetition, meaning repeating the same point but using different examples? Or am I developing my paper through pushing the analysis further? And many of us in our initial writing stages, as we improve on our composition skills, often are challenged with development and that analysis. And one of the tricks that I like to share is question. If you make a statement about something, then you ask why, how, what value does that bring? Ask yourself those questions. Similarly, if you're using a quote, you want to ask yourself, why is this quote important? What about whatever this quote is saying matters the most to my argument? Can my readers take away what this quote is saying by what I've just explained, or do I need to add more? What you don't want to do in an analysis that follows a quote is just repeat what the quote just said. You want to interpret it for your readers instead, okay? And then finally, another tip, identify all long sentences and work to reduce their word count, all right? Sometimes in long sentences, what you'll end up finding is that a comma splice is there, meaning you need a conjunction, you need a semicolon, or you need a period. And even so, you can likely reduce the words within that sentence to make the reading smoother and more concise. Okay, so finally we have staying on topic. And I know that when we're doing argument papers, we often can get very passionate about what we are arguing for, right? And that passion sometimes translates into veering off topic, going on a tangent. So one tip is to reverse outline your paper. And for any of you who followed me last week in the recording of the COVID-19 New York Times article that I analyzed and broke down for you, that was a reverse outline in some ways, right? I applied the basic features to it, and I also broke it down in terms of the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. But I also could show you, if I wanted to, summarize every paragraph and what that paragraph is trying to do. And so if you do that for your own paper after you've written it, and then you compare it to the initial outline you developed, that can help you identify where you have extraneous detail, okay? You also want to read a paragraph line by line. Are my examples and analysis related to my main point? Both the main point of the thesis or the paper, but also the main idea that you're writing about in your paragraph. And this relates to concision because does this example or analysis already get produced by me earlier, either within the same paper or in an earlier paragraph? And if it does, then you need to remove it. Finally, right, we need to think about words that elicit emotion. We want to make sure that we omit those types of words, such as ridiculous or stupid even, or blatantly wrong, right? We are trying to convince those, for the most part, that don't believe the way we do about a particular topic to consider our views and perhaps even switch theirs. The last thing you want to do is alienate your readership. Okay, you already have the readers on board who believe the same things as you. You need to get the readers on board who don't. And so you don't want to offend them, either by directly offending people that they would value, or by directly including that reader population in your negative assessments. Okay? All right, so I wanted to show you a recent editing job I had to do for a chapter that is being published by myself and a colleague in a book next year. And so what I've done is initially, so we had an 8,500 word count limit. And what we found was that after completing our chapter, we were hovering at about 11,000 words. So we needed to cut out 2,500 words. That's significant. And one of the ways we did it was by moving from paragraph to paragraph to take out and rephrase language that is extraneous. And not only did it improve our writing style, but it also helped us with word count, right? Because when you have word count limits and also word count minimums, there's a point to them. The point could be that, especially for the ones I give you, if you're not meeting the minimum word count, you're not actually producing the substantive argument that I want you to be producing. If you're going over the word count, that means that you're not writing as concisely as you need to, okay? Because there are always going to be limits to your work, whether that be because you're publishing and you're given only a specific word count to fit the page or the book that they're publishing, or whether that be for a presentation when you're only given 10 minutes, right? Marketing, if you're producing a poster or producing an advertisement where the words on the page are very, very limited. So word choice, word count, they all matter. So I'm going to just do a brief comparison as I narrate this. So at one point, a teaching assistant, TA, wanted to know if, now I cut out 2 words there by just saying asked whether, right? We follow that with he could participate in WAFIA and he was very enthusiastic, right? So, and he was very is 4 words and very is that superlative, and it didn't need to be so wordy. Expressing enthusiasm does a better job at using a verb expressing versus using a verb to be, he was. So we actually understand more about this person's actions, expressing enthusiasm, right? That is enough. We didn't need to have very much expressing enthusiasm or he was very enthusiastic. We can just narrow that down. I'm going to jump down. While an intriguing possibility, you notice the 2 are the same, opening access of the program to TAs. Now, what I ended up doing was cutting out 2 words there, opening the program to TAs, because there's a redundancy. Opening access, access is implied if we just say opening the program. So we're able to omit access of, and it says the same thing more concisely, right? Finally, we have, penultimately, we have, for example, experienced instructors. Well, we don't need that for experience, that for example. It follows just from the sentence itself because it's integrated into what the topic is. So an experienced instructors, it's repetitive in the sense that we just have seasoned instructors above that. And for word variety, we want to move away from instructors. So career faculty, right? That indicates that experience, that professionalism, and that they are instructors because instructors are faculty. Okay, now finally, the more established lecturers also often have greater insights, this is the first one, into how to engage appropriately students in a tutoring environment. Now, appropriately is one of those added filler words. Appropriately is not needed. So instead, how to engage with students in a tutoring environment. And so we actually added a word here, but what we took away was that superlative. And that's important. We want to omit superlatives as much as possible. The word itself should be doing the work. We don't need to necessarily modify it, okay, with a superlative. Okay, well, that concludes our lesson today. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson and it can be useful for you. And I'll be on again. All right, bye-bye.